Hey everybody, John Fenn, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org. We are a house church network. We celebrate the gathering of the saints the way they did in the New Testament and how they went from 120 people at Pentecost to saturating the Roman Empire in 300 years. We practice the same practice of multiplication, which is that we rotate, for those who want to, rotate homes and who wants to host, and then rotate who leads each week, so that there's always a core group of people who are used to rotating and used to leading. And so when you outgrow a home, they just multiply out just like a cell dividing, and they begin rotating and leading among themselves, and so on and so on. That's how they went from 120 to saturating the Roman Empire. So we do the same thing. Visit our website, CWOWI.org. There's 10 question answer videos about house church. There's lots of material there. Sign up for my weekly thoughts, weekly teaching on a variety of subjects that comes out by email on Friday. That's where we put information about our meetings and conferences and such. But today, looking at the difference between little faith and unbelief. They're not the same. And a lot of people are thinking, help my faith, or like the man whose son needed to be delivered. He said, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Clearly, those are two separate things. Faith comes by hearing the word. Faith comes by a revelation from God. When you heard about Jesus, the Father started dealing with you, and that's revelation. What Jesus told Peter in Matthew chapter 16, verses 16 and 17, when he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said, "My Father has showed this to you, Peter." That's how the kingdom functions. We first receive a revelation, illumination, enlightenment, the New Testament calls it, from the Father about who Jesus is, and it flows from there. Faith comes by hearing, Romans 10:17, and hearing by the word of God. The word there is the word rhema. It means rhema is used as a word that designates God speaking to man. That is, that God shows you something. He gives you grace. He gives you a revelation. And faith comes by receiving that word from God. Faith doesn't come just by reading Genesis through Revelation. Faith comes by a specific word to you, and then you act on it. Noah received instruction to build the boat. Faith was his response. He received the grace to build, the favor to build the boat, the revelation to build the boat with the plans. Faith was his response. Abraham received the grace, the revelation that he was to be the father of many nations. And the Lord said, "Take a walk, I'll show you the promised land." Faith was the response to that grace. That's what faith is. You cannot have faith without first a revelation, that grace from the Father. You just can't have faith. Otherwise, it's just hope. It stays in the emotional realm. Romans 4 talks about how Abraham believed the hope. The promise presented hope that he could yet have a child, and he chose to believe and was fully persuaded in that. That response is faith. So a good example of little faith is when, and we see this within the context of someone who starts out in faith and then they stop partway through. It would be like Noah receiving the grace to build the boat and then halfway through stopping when he saw the storm clouds gathering and all the people against him and having doubt. The great example in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 31 is of Peter walking on the water. You'll recall Jesus came walking on the water and they cried out, and Jesus invited Peter to come walk with him on the water. That is a rhema. That is a revelation. And it gave faith in Peter. When Jesus said, "Come," Peter put one leg over the edge of the boat and then the other leg and stood on the water and walked on the water to Jesus. That response to the command, that response to the revelation was faith. When Peter got out there almost to Jesus, it says he started looking at the wind and the waves and became afraid, and he started to sink. And Jesus grabbed him and he said in Matthew 14:31, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" So you see, little faith has to do with someone who starts on a project, starts on something, a response from the revelation, and then stops or hesitates or becomes afraid, looking around at the wind and the waves. You see this with people going on missions trips. You see this with people with business ventures. You see this with all kinds of things. Maybe you've got a revelation that you've got a particular job. You've applied for many jobs, but suddenly you have a peace about that you've got a job. Well, that peace is the rhema. It's the word to you, and faith is the response. Faith is going to apply for that job, going to the interview and getting that job. But maybe the job is difficult. Maybe the boss is mean, and you start to wonder, was this really God or not? Okay, that's an example of little faith. You responded from a revelation. So once you respond from a revelation, the key is, go back to that revelation. Are you sure that was from the Lord? If yes, you walk it through and say, yeah, that was a revelation from the Lord. I have peace about it. I had peace. I responded. Then you stop looking at the wind and the waves and you march on to Jesus. You march on. You walk on to finish the work. Don't look at the wind and the waves. That is of little faith. That's like Noah stopping halfway through, or Abraham going half the trip and then wondering if God really sent him, or Moses, from the burning bush going down to Egypt and stopping about halfway saying, was that real or was that a dream? Once you receive the revelation and you start responding to it, don't look at the wind and the waves. Okay, that's little faith, to stop and look at the waves. That's little faith. No, march on, go on through the difficulty. Unbelief is something different. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus is in his hometown and the people don't believe him. They listen to his wisdom and everything else, and it says, who is this? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this the son of Mary? Aren't his four, and they name four brothers, James, Jude, and Simon, and another one. Aren't his four brothers here with us? Aren't his sisters here with us? I mean, they name six, at least six, four brothers and at least two sisters, because sisters is plural in Mark chapter 6. So Jesus doesn't have any credibility because they know him from the time he was a little kid. They know the family. And it says in Mark 6, and especially verse 6, it says he marveled because of their unbelief. He marveled because of their unbelief, and he could there do no mighty works except lay hands on a few sickly people. And then he went on and he went about teaching in their other villages in the area. Excuse me. So what it presents is this: a level of unbelief that wasn't lack of faith. They had not received a rhema, a specific word from the Lord that they needed to act on. It was a threshold they had to get over, which was the natural circumstances of this boy, now man, Jesus, whose mother is in their midst, whose brothers are in their midst, whose sisters are in their midst, and he doesn't have credibility because they know him, because of that familiarity. And so a level of unbelief rises. Now this happens to us in the natural. You can put somebody on a pedestal, you can put a pastor or whatever on a pedestal, you can put a significant other up on a pedestal, you think they're perfect. It's infatuation, And then something happens where you find out, hey, they're human. And so a level of unbelief towards them, they lose credibility, they lose respect in your eyes in that way. And so in this way, this is what happened with Jesus. So in our modern lives, it can be likened to a familiarity with the Lord that we don't understand the reverence, the awe of who we're dealing with. And our faith becomes so commonplace that we don't live for that revelation that comes from the Lord. It's just commonplace. And more than that, let me extrapolate it out a little bit. Sometimes things happen in life that are unexplained. People die, accidents, diseases. Why do bad things happen to good people? There are things that happen to us, and it can cause some people to question their faith. And it's not just having little faith, but it's a level of unbelief because of the unanswered questions. I go back to Mark chapter 6, Jesus in his hometown. Those people had all sorts of questions because they asked him, who does he think he is? They ask, if you read that passage, how did he get this knowledge? How did he get this wisdom? They have questions that Jesus isn't answering for them. And they have these questions about how this could be. So it's like us having questions in life. Why did so-and-so die? Why did so-and-so get sick? Why did you let that accident happen? Why did this happen? We have so many questions that are not getting answered. We're like the people in the village there that have the questions, and Jesus isn't answering them. He's just going about his business and encouraging them to come along with him, leaving the questions for heaven to be answered. And so this is what happens with Christians many times, is a level of unbelief rises because of unanswered questions, because of baggage from this world, things that we question. And so it causes us to distrust the Lord. It causes him to lose credibility in our eyes because we have so many questions that he's not answering. Just like the villagers there in his hometown of Nazareth and in that area. And that level of unbelief means he couldn't do a lot of mighty works because they had questioned his credibility, his faithfulness, etc. Could they trust him? And so that's very different than having Peter responding to an invitation to walk on the water and then stopping partway through because he, was looking at the wind and the waves. And Jesus said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" That's doubt comes in after you're walking along in faith. Unbelief is something where you have unanswered questions. And folks, the Lord's not going to answer them all. And what you have to settle with, and maybe I need to conclude with this, is what you have to settle in your heart is that there are going to be questions that can only be answered in heaven. And be okay with that. Rest in that. Go back to your larger trust in the Lord, like Paul did at the end of his life in 2 Timothy chapter 4, and in his letter, actually earlier on there in chapter 2, but he talks about, he says, "I know, I'm fully persuaded that the things which I have entrusted to him, he is faithfully keeping for me until that day." I'm fully persuaded that what I have entrusted to him, he is able to keep until that day. So there are things that you and I have that aren't going to be answered on this side. And just like the villagers. So don't let those unanswered questions cause unbelief to rise in you. Don't let them lead to the questioning the credibility and the trustworthiness and the faithfulness of the Lord. What you need to do is shift your attention to what you do know, not what you don't know. Stop speculating about silly doctrinal things that you can't answer the question on this side of heaven anyway. That's useless waste of time. And stop speculating about why did so-and-so hurt, and Lord, I'm really hurt, I'm really angry at you because this and that happened and everything else. Lay that all aside and refocus on the Lord. What is the last thing he showed you? What is the last scripture to jump out at you? What is the last message that touched your heart, that resonated with you, that said, this is for me? That's where he's leading right now. That's where he's teaching you right now. We all have questions that will be answered only on the other side. So you have to be okay with that. Don't let the level of unbelief rise in you, but choose rather to focus on what he has shown you, what he is dealing with you on, what he is teaching you on. Focus on what you have, not on what you have not. So I hope this has been a blessing to you, give you some food for thought, the difference between faith and unbelief. And lay the unbelief aside. Jesus' remedy for them, according to Mark chapter 6, was he went around their villages teaching. Teaching means that he was, rather than answer their questions, he wanted to teach them something. And so that is the thing you need to do. Get before the Lord. Say, Lord, what are you saying to me? It may be peace. It may be rest. It may be just let the questions go. Whatever it is, focus on what he's teaching you today. That's the remedy of unbelief, for unbelief, is just get alone with him. Let that arise. Let that revelation, let that grace arise. Let that faith arise again and become fresh in you. All right, God bless. Bye-bye.